All right, it looks like we have a few folks jumping in already. I want to say welcome and thank you very much for coming to our workshop today. We're going to let a few folks, it usually takes a couple of minutes for everyone to come in, so we'll get started here in just a minute. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Just want to, for the few folks who've come in here in the last minute, I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining us today. We're going to wait one more minute just to let a few more folks roll in, and then we will get started. Thanks for coming today. All right, I'll go ahead and get us kicked out, get it kicked off here. Eric, you are muted. This is a workshop, so we'll have a presentation from Brita today. And near the end of the presentation, at any point in time, you can feel free to put in questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom, and we will answer questions at the end of today's presentation. We have a lot of information to get through today, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us here today, and thank you for joining SCORE Maine and Brita from Prosper HR for today's workshop on hiring your first employee. I also want to say a big thank you to the Maine Technology Institute, who sponsors this workshop. And I want to say thank you to the SBA, as SCORE is a resource partner for the Small Business Administration. And we help folks from every part of the business life cycle from start to exit with workshops just like this one. And we also offer free confidential one-on-one mentoring to business owners. And we look forward to responding to your questions at the end today. Feel free to put them in the Q&A panel. And with that, I will turn it over to Brita to introduce herself. Thank you very much today, Brita.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Dan. It's nice to meet everyone. My name is Brita Loppnow. I am the founder and CEO of Prosper HR. I'm actually going to share my screen, so as I talk, I can do my introduction and you can read along as well. So bear with me here as I share my screen. Okay, I'll jump into my introduction now that this is, Dan, can you see that okay?
Yeah, we're good to go.
Perfect. All right. So like I mentioned, my name is Brita Loppnow, and I am the founder and CEO of Prosper HR. Today, we will be talking about hiring your first employee. Very excited about this topic. So this is a little bit about me. I work with startups, small businesses, and I provide fractional HR support. So I do with the fractional side of HR advising. I provide strategic HR leadership to my clients, and I do a lot of employee experience projects, one of those being how to hire your first employee. I am a certified career coach, and I have a certification through the Society for Human Resource Management. I have an MBA in strategic leadership as well. And then you can see some of my work experience there. These slides will be shared later. So if you want to connect on LinkedIn, this link will take you to my LinkedIn following the presentation. So here's an overview of what we are going to cover. It is going to be a lot of information. don't feel obligated to take it all in one session. Again, these slides will be shared. And, there will be opportunities if you want to connect afterwards too. So with that said, we're going to jump into this agenda and dive into these topics. So I'd like to first just start with talking about the difference between an employee and a contractor. As small business owners, I think, oftentimes we dive into hiring contractors. Just initially, it's an easier process than actually hiring an employee. And so there are key differences that need to be considered when thinking about, is this person going to be a long-term contractor or an employee? And so as we think about transitioning contractors oftentimes over to an employee, these are the main factors that we need to think about. And so a contractor, as you can see, is someone that has more control over their work. They are choosing their own schedule, how they perform the work, when it gets done. In some cases, of course, there's timelines involved. They're also paying their own taxes. And that will be a big part when we talk about costs of employees. There's also, the payment structure tends to be different with contractors, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. And then also, typically a contractor, even if it is a longer term assignment, if it's temporary in nature, it's going to be a contractor. So when you look at an employee, it's really important that contractors versus employee, the classification of that individual matters. And so it is important to make sure that you are truly classifying that person as an employee. And where that comes into play when thinking about an employee would be thinking of things like control. Does this individual have specific work schedules? Are there tasks that you are hiring them to do, which would involve a job description? Taxes are going to be very important, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. So a W-4 is going to be the tax form. Each state, some states, I should say, have different W-4s in addition to the federal tax form. And so it's important that an employee is completing that. There are going to be other forms that we talk about, which an employee will need to complete as well, that sets a 1099 contractor apart from an employee. And then thinking about payments. So an employee is going to receive a regular paycheck based upon what you agree the pay structure is. That could be monthly, that could be semi-monthly, bi-weekly. In some cases, it could be weekly. But there is a structured payment process, and that involves the taxes as well. And then that may include, not always, especially for a first employee, it could include benefits, your health insurance, retirement, 401k, time off, things like that. Then also there are legal protections in place for employees. And so it's really important to have a full understanding, if there's any kind of hesitations or questions around these pieces, it's very important to understand those before hiring an employee. And then when the assignment piece that comes into place would be for the duration of the role and the consistency of the role, right? So is it going to be a long-term commitment where you would hope this employee is invested in your company for a substantial amount of time, whether that's 1 year or, could be less in some cases, but typically you'd hope that they would stay for 1 year or more. So thinking of these things will be very important as you decide, do you want to continue on a contractor agreement, or are you going to be hiring truly an employee? So then we move along to the costs to consider when hiring an employee. Now, these are not all the costs. This is not inclusive of all of them. I just want to say that up front, but these are typical costs that you should consider, I would say, before you hire your first employee. And so salary is a big one. That is going to be the annual wages for an employee. So it's good to look at this as like the big picture. What is someone's salary? However, an employee might be hired as an hourly employee, so that would obviously be broken down a little bit differently. But when budgeting, you'll want to look at it as the bigger picture and look at what the annual salary is going to be. Benefits are going to be something that you may not even consider in the beginning, because these do become a bit costly. But it is something to consider if you're going to, hire beyond one employee. You may want to consider what are the costs of benefits. So some of these benefits are going to be health insurance, which could be health, dental, vision, retirement plans. And as some of you may know, as small business owners, you are going to, if you're based in Maine, a 401k plan is going to be required that employers offer. And so that is something that you'll definitely need to consider. Also, there's PTO, so paid time off, policies, and holidays. This is not inclusive of all the benefits an organization could offer. These are the ones that are suggested as you consider hiring your first employee. We could get into this much deeper if we wanted to talk about wellness or, other types of benefits that could be offered. But these are the typical ones that you may consider when hiring your first employee. Also, taxes are going to play a big factor in costs. If you currently have contractors, you're obviously not paying any payroll taxes on them. They are paying their own taxes, through their W-9. And you will certainly need to now consider those payroll taxes as an employer. So each employee is going to be paying part of the payroll tax, and then you would be paying the other portion of the payroll tax. And so those taxes include Social Security, Medicare, unemployment. You may also need to be setting up like workers' comp insurance. Things like that will be additional costs to you. The other piece is recruitment expenses. So you can see here, the recruitment expenses involved. So that's posting jobs, who's involved in the recruitment process, because although it sounds, you need to consider the amount of time in a recruitment process. So how much of your time are you spending recruiting, and how much does that add up to in terms of dollar amounts? Also, some additional hiring costs could be like background checks. If you do any drug testing, if someone's, operating heavy machinery or something, you may need to do other types of screenings. So things like that may be additional costs to you. And then, of course, onboarding costs. So the training, orientations, learning materials, and different types of onboarding. So even like if you have an HR system, so an HRIS is what I would call it, where you would keep electronic personnel files. Those are all onboarding costs that you may want to consider. Additionally, equipment is a big one. So some employers do offer laptops, phones. Now with remote work, having a stipend for home office expenses and supplies. Those are all things you may want to consider. There are some employers who ask employees to bring their own laptop. However, that may be something that your IP, your intellectual property is proprietary data is not going to necessarily be protected in that case. So just things to consider as you are hiring this employee. What will those costs be? And in addition to that, there are stipends you could give if someone is working from home. Some employers offer Wi-Fi stipends. cell phone stipends, things like that. Software is another big one. So thinking about subscription fees. So let's say you use Slack or Google Suite or Google Workspace, I guess it's called now. Those are all going to be subscription fees, and those are probably the basics. But there are going to be others that are very specific to your business as well. So moving along, these are some other considerations that are much more HR heavy. And I do think it's important. I'll let you read through each of these. We won't go over these so in depth just for the sake of time. But it is important to ensure that employees are classified correctly. I'm not an employment lawyer, but I've worked with many of them in my HR career, and I would say that misclassifying employees can be very detrimental to a business. And so I think it's just important to truly understand how you're going to be classifying your employee. So whether that's full-time or part-time, you'll want to get that information correct. You know, sometimes if you offer health insurance, there are different rules for what makes someone part-time versus full-time. So it's not the 40 hours necessarily. And that's where you may want to work with an HR expert who could help guide you on the differentiating factors of part-time and full-time employees. And same goes with exempt and non-exempt. Typically, non-exempt employees would receive overtime. This is just a very general statement. And then exempt employees typically do not receive any overtime. But there, again, are some factors that go into each of those. Now, temporary, where it says full-time, part-time, and temporary employees, there are other types. So to make things a little bit more complicated, there could be interns, there could be seasonal. So there are different types of employees as well. So it's just important to ensure that you know you're classifying your employees correctly. I will say on this part-time, this is not necessarily specific with the 401k. It's not 401k can be offered. 401k must be offered to employees in Maine by a certain date. That's not part of this presentation, but there are different factors that go into the eligibility. And so this eligibility piece is not necessarily specific to part-time employees only. So I want to talk about the new hire documents. I think this is very important. And these are not necessarily all the new hire documents, but these are ones that are typically used. So I've outlined here what each document is used for, and like when you would need it. So, and this is all specific for every employee, not just your first employee. So you'll need to complete an I-9 form, which essentially it verifies the identification and the employment. It verifies whether an employee is authorized to be working within the US. So that is very important. That is mandatory, and it must be completed within 3 days of the new hire start date. The W-4 is a payroll form that would need to be completed. And this is also a very important form that would need to be completed in order to have payroll taxes submitted in the appropriate amount of time. This is a mandatory document, and there are state-specific W-4s as well in some cases. I think it's very important to provide an onboarding checklist. That way you can stay on track of the different new hire tasks. And then also you may want to create some sort of, if you're using Google, like it's easy to create a Google form where you're collecting new hire information. So you'll want to have the new hire's address, their contact information, emergency contact information, things like that. So you can kind of create that on your own, or if you use an HR like system of some sort, they'll have that automated in there. The offer letter will go into depth a little in a couple more slides. So you'll want to put the terms and conditions of employment to a candidate in an offer letter. That's extremely important, and to get the offer letter signed. That will be some part of the, I would say, the new hire offer package. And then as well as the employment agreement, that will be something it would be actually a legally binding document. And so you would probably want to have that reviewed by a lawyer at some point. But you would need to, I would highly suggest having an employment agreement in place for a new hire. That would be offered in conjunction with an offer letter, I should say, as well. Then we have the employee handbook, which we'll talk about in a second as well. I am a believer in employee handbooks so that you can really, and thinking about this even before you hire your first employee, so you can truly create the company culture that you want by building policies and processes, and really setting like expectations around ways of working in your company. A handbook doesn't necessarily have to be, I think it kind of gets a bad reputation at times. It can be oftentimes, it doesn't need to be stuffy. It doesn't have to be super formal, but I do think it's important to have a handbook if you're going to follow those policies, and to create those policies in advance of hiring your first employee. A non-disclosure agreement, also known as the NDA, is also a legal document that you would maybe want support from a legal team, a legal professional, so that it essentially will protect confidential information. So that is something that you may want to consider. I always recommend an outside activities policy. Just now with remote work, doesn't have to say prohibit any additional employment outside of an employee's role. Doesn't have to prohibit it, but it should lay out some specific guidelines as to what your company allows, whether you allow an outside, I call them outside activities, but it could be outside employment policy. I think it's important to put these guidelines in there up front and develop those so that there are clear expectations. Lastly, you may want an intellectual property agreement, also known as the IP agreement. This would allow the organization to have rights and ownership over any creative or original work that's created as a function of the job the employee is hired for. Those are just a few, very high level. There's so much more to these, but again, for the sake of time, we'll move forward. But we can certainly, happy to answer questions about that as well. And again, these are not all inclusive of the onboarding documents. These are ones that are very popular and are typically utilized in the hiring process. So one of my favorite topics is company policies. I love creating handbooks. I think compliance is so important, and it can be quite very, very comprehensive, and it's a lot to understand, which is why it might make sense to not attempt to create your own handbook, but hire a fractional HR, some sort of HR support to complete your handbook. There is a caveat to the handbook. So I love handbooks. However, I don't always recommend them to clients that I work with, because the caveat there is a handbook is so important if you're going to use it. There's no need to create one if you're not going to follow your own policies, or you don't expect the team to follow the policies. And that only happens very rarely, but I always say that because some companies aren't following their own policies. And it's so important too. If you're creating these expectations, that's what a handbook is there for. So when thinking of a handbook, this could be a whole topic, a whole workshop in itself, I think. A handbook is so in-depth, but at a high level, a handbook really explains an employee's rights. There are going to be federal, state, and sometimes local laws included in a handbook. So it's important to work with someone who knows your state, who knows your city, and sometimes it's industry specific. So it's important to know that as well. The expectations that a handbook creates will help with how an employee conducts themselves, internally and externally, and how the organization expects them to conduct themselves. Also, the other big thing is that a handbook is going to help establish the company culture. It's going to not only communicate values and norms, but also what are the best ways of working? How do we work together? What are the clear expectations? And that's where the policies come into play. So policy is always like a scary word, but I think that, a policy doesn't have to be written in a very stringent way. It can be in a friendly tone. And that's also kind of where the company culture plays into the handbook of like, how is it written? So we want to create these frameworks early on. And I think it's so important. I do see a lot of clients come to me and they haven't really thought about a handbook, and they're 25 employees, and they're suddenly like, oh no, we're having issues with all these things and we don't have any policies around it. And that's where, I come in to help. But I think it's important mostly to put these policies in place at the beginning, before you even hire someone. And of course, these are not things that are set in stone. They're set in stone to some extent. When an employee reads it and they sign it, you're like, okay, good, these are policies. They can be changed at any time. So as your organization grows and transforms, you can always change a policy. It's never set in stone, unless of course it is a federal, state, or a local law. We wouldn't be changing those, but anything that is customizable to your company, those policies can be changed throughout time. So it's just nice to have something in place as a foundation to build your framework, and then knowing that you can change that throughout time. So we're going to move forward into job descriptions. This is a big part of what seems to be the hiring process. I think it starts way before the hiring process. So as you're thinking of who your next hire is going to be, what job you need fulfilled, you'll want to consider these steps to creating a really great job description. So some of these are pretty self-explanatory, common knowledge. But I do think it's great to just have these outlined here, because there are some that require a little bit more thought. And so when establishing a job description, or a job title, excuse me, it seems relatively like, okay, I can pick a job title, but I think a little bit of thought needs to go into the job title, because one thing that not everybody thinks about when they hire their first employee is that if you hire someone with, with a certain level of experience and you give them an inflated title, where do they have to go from there? What opportunity do they have if they've already received the highest title? So it is important to choose, for example, a really sound title where it allows room for growth and development. And I see this a lot in the startups I work with, where they give inflated titles. Someone will be hired in as a director when they're really, more of a coordinator, manager type of role. And then I always ask, well, where does this person have to grow? Like they need room for growth, right? So I think although some of these like establish a job title, it sounds very simple, right? We can put it into simple terms, but there is a lot of thought that needs to go behind each of these aspects of creating a good job description. I want to mention here the last one where it says establish a salary range. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of compliance and laws, I do want to just mention that if you are posting a job in certain states, it is helpful to do some research, because in states like Colorado, New York City, you may be required by law to post the salary range. And so I personally would just suggest like best ways of working is like adding the salary range to every job description when you post it externally, just to get yourself into that habit, and that you don't have to research if you're hiring remotely, you wouldn't have to research every single state, because each state law differs slightly. So it might be a good habit to just post the salary range. That is all I'm going to mention there. The other big thing here is the recruitment strategy. This again is a deeper topic of creating a true recruitment strategy and process. But here are the areas to kind of consider as you're setting up when you're ready to hire and you're like, okay, I've got my job description written. Now I need to post it somewhere. And then what will be my recruitment strategy? So as you look at this, it's important when it says select hiring committee, in some cases, if you're a small business owner, it might just be you, and that's okay. So really understand, who's going to be part of that process. If there's 2 founders, well, great. Then you both could be potentially part of that hiring committee. So just really understanding. And then as the team grows, that will become much more important to you as you are hiring more employees. Where it says sourcing could be like, where are you posting and how are you getting a diverse talent pool? And then as well, and we won't go, just thinking about where you're going to post this job is going to be on external sites, word of mouth, using recruiters, external recruiters, things like that. Also creating an interview plan. So you don't want to just walk into the interview when you're in the interview, you don't want to just walk in and just start rattling off questions. It's really important that you, as you're hiring, you create some sort of rubric where you're measuring each candidate against that rubric. It's not just asking questions as they come to you. You should have specific question guides already pre-written in that interview phase. So I think it's great to establish that going into your hiring process. Also, thinking about the timeline. So you're like, okay, we need this hire, we need to hire them tomorrow. Is that even realistic? Probably not. So really thinking about how much time is going to be you can commit to this hiring process, and then thinking about all the pieces that go into it. There's administrative pieces of scheduling and arranging for the interviews to take place. And it may not be just one interview. So really thinking about what is this timeline looking like when hiring for your first employee and beyond. Here's a breakdown of the job offer process. When you found your perfect candidate and you want to hire them. So typically you may extend a verbal conditional offer. So maybe calling them and letting them know you're interested in hiring them into the role. And then they may verbally accept. You may do a reference check. Some employers do not. So that's kind of up to you. Extending the written offer, which we'll get into what the offer looks like, key pieces to have in that offer letter. That will be the next slide. And then some employers may want to do a background check. There are other parts that you can play around with, but these are in general steps that you may take. Once the offer has been accepted, that would be once all those conditional steps listed above are completed. Then a new hire agreement would be signed, which is a little bit different than the offer letter because it goes much more into the nitty-gritty, more legal terms of the agreement. And then the pre-onboarding planning and process would begin. So the job offer. These, I'm just going to show this slide here so I can make sure we have enough time. But as you write a job offer letter, you are going to want to include a variety of information so that you're setting clear expectations up front for the new hire and so that they understand what they're getting into. So this does not include any of the legal terms and conditions. This is more of the HR focus of what you would want to include in that job offer letter. Doesn't have to be anything lengthy. The shorter the better, so that they can read it, agree to it, sign it, and be on, and be on their way to accepting it fully. So these are just some areas of reminders of things that you would want to include. And, as a small business owner, you may not have benefits. You may not offer paid time off initially, depending on, which state you're located. So these are, not required. Not all of them are required, of course, but they're recommended to consider. Then we jump into the pre-onboarding step. So you have your new hire, they've signed the offer, they're ready to go, you've given them a start date. You would then go into the pre-onboarding steps. And that is typically you as the business owner, or if you have HR to help you, or you have designated hiring manager, anybody of those three normally would be like the responsibilities of the pre-onboarding steps are listed below. So these are also not required, just suggestions, helpful tips of things that are typically within the pre-onboarding steps. So a training plan is always helpful. Because this will help to essentially set your new hire up for success, right? So you will want to do a first day orientation. As I say these, just keep in mind, if you have a fully remote team or some of your team is remote, all of this can really be done remotely too. So it's not specific to being like sometimes when people think of trainings, they're like, oh gosh, does it have to be in person? It does not. It can always be on through Zoom or whatnot. But thinking about that, so the first day orientation is going to be so important. That's just walking through. You wouldn't want your new hire to join and be like, what do I have to do? Who's going to reach out to me? What time do I log on? Have all these questions. You want to provide that upfront so that on their first day, they can jump into the orientation and be trained on starting to get trained on their role, meeting the team, things like that. So in some cases, there could be state and federal training requirements. So just keeping that in mind. And then also like providing upfront a timeline for the onboarding. Those will all be part of the training plan. And then also just ensuring that if there are meetings that you want your new hire to join, especially immediately on their first day, their first week, just knowing that maybe it's easier for you to schedule those and add those to their calendars so that they don't have to think about it on their first day. So these are all just small things that go into really perfecting your onboarding program and creating a positive, simple, easy, straightforward experience for your new hire, because you do want to think about from the perspective of you as the employer, but also what is the employee experiencing as well. And you would hope that that would be a very positive experience. The more positive experience they are provided up front, potentially that means they may stay and have a more positive experience moving forward. So you have your new hire, they're joining and they're here, you know, with you on the first day. What does that first day look like? So this is where company culture really comes into play. You're going to want to really communicate that to your new hire. What are your company values? What's your mission statement? What are you all working towards as a team? What does the team look like? So, you know, really communicating all of that so that they are on board, fully engaged. They feel like they are part of your company, your community. And that can be done with the introduction of like your company culture, ways of working, policies and procedures. And then that's where you would want to show them that training plan that we just talked about. So like, who are they meeting with? What kind of meetings, what's the meeting cadences? What are they going to learn in their first week? What are the expectations? Those are all things you'd want to introduce to them. And then making sure before their first day, like, is their email set up? You don't want to be scrambling around on their first day and they can't access things. Also, when thinking about like benefit packages and things like that, those will be things that you would want to communicate on the first day, but already, you know, you may want to have some of that already set up. That could also emerge in time. So it doesn't necessarily mean you'll have that all ready to go. If it doesn't make sense for the business at that moment. So just keep that in mind. That doesn't always have to be ready on their first day. Especially if it's your first few new hires. Here are the new hire forms. Again, these are things that we I outlined on that previous guide. So I won't go into these too much, but they're all outlined on that guide in the previous slide. It's important to really monitor the first 90 days of an employee's time with your company. So those would be the first 3 months. What's being established in the first 3 months? And that's where that training guidelines that I just mentioned on the other slide, that's where that will become very important. So things that you may consider are like team building activities where they become more engaged with the team. You really want the new hire to feel connected with the team, or if it's just you, connecting with them individually. And then also being able to provide them the tools and training they need to be successful, setting clear goals for either, you know, the upcoming quarter or for the whole year. Like, what does that look like with your business and how does that new hire fall into that? And setting those clear, attainable goals is going to be very important for their success. It's also important. Feedback during the first 90 days is very important. And that should be coming from, you know, the new hire's hiring manager, and that could be you. Or also, it's just great to be providing the new hire feedback, and also for them to be able to provide their feedback. Like, what has their experience been, so that you can also improve your onboarding experience for other new hires. And just to wrap things up, I was trying to stay on time here. I think I did okay. Just to wrap things up, you know, a lot of questions do come up with new hires and onboarding new hires, getting different documents in place. And there's always help out there. If it's not me, it could be somebody else. Prosper HR is my consulting firm, and we do specialize in small businesses and startups, of course. I know this was so much information to throw at all of you at once, but I hope that it was helpful in a sense of getting just high-level information about hiring your first employee. So with that said, I think we can open it up to questions. Does that work, Dan?
Oh yeah, and you're totally right. It's a lot of information, but it's one of those huge topics where you kind of have to cover a lot, especially with all the taxes and the laws involved.
Yes.
I actually think that gets into some of our questions quite nicely. We actually have a question from Eric, who is a contractor, and he's currently working with a subcontractor who's probably 1099 for him. And that subcontractor is leaving and he's considering scaling up or calling it quits. Can you talk about the relationship between pay and taxes, like what that balance looks like for an employee? And he's essentially hoping to understand what it costs to actually hire an employee with taxes and everything else included.
Mm. So I am not necessarily a payroll expert, so I'm not going to be able to give you the exact percentages, but I'm going to do my best here. So, as a contractor, so I guess is the question referring to if Eric hires somebody, or if he becomes an employee versus a contractor?
If I had to take a guess at it here, I would say that Eric is looking into hiring an employee,
Okay.
and he's just trying to understand like the true costs.
Okay. So if you are looking at hiring an employee, the costs, especially upfront costs, I think are going to be more significant than a contractor. So a contractor is paying, they're 1099, which means they're paying all of their state taxes, federal taxes at the end of the year. That is not your responsibility. If they are contracting through you, not your responsibility. That is on them. You would provide them a W-9 1099 at the end of the year. Well, they provide you a W-9, and then you would provide them a 1099 at the end of the year, and they would take that and they deal with the IRS and the state, and they pay their taxes, right? That is, I don't know what the percent, like everybody kind of withholds their own percentage of taxes in that case. And as an employer, you are not paying into those. So that there's really no upfront costs in terms of taxes per se. Now, if you were to hire that contractor, those taxes become, I think it's like 7 point something percent the employer pays, and then the employee also pays. So you're paying an additional amount into, and it's not every, I should clarify here, it depends where that employee is located, right? So there are some states that there is no state income tax. So as an employer, you may not pay into that state income tax as you would if you are hiring someone in Maine. There is state income tax in Maine. So, but Maine versus Texas or Florida or another state where there is no state income tax, those are options you may want to weigh. And then, I'm sorry.
Do you know what that number is in Maine?
For state income tax, I don't know specifically what the state, no, I don't know what that number is.
Okay. We had a comment come in from someone else who appears to be a bookkeeper, and they're saying that it's typically about 20 to 30% on top of their payroll. Does that sound about right to you?
Yep, that does sound about right. Thank you for whomever chimed in there. That's helpful.
So, Eric, it looks like you might be looking at an additional 20 to 30% on top of the hourly wage that you're looking to pay for someone. And actually, the question that we have a few more questions here, but one that I had that I think is really big, and I didn't realize how big it was until this presentation today, is the time commitment involved in getting the process started. Like if you had to guesstimate, and I know it's going to be different for every business, but if you're a Maine business, what would you expect the time commitment to look like for just getting the processes in place for hiring?
Well, yeah, that's a big question. So it depends if you're doing it on your own and you have no knowledge of this. It's going to require researching, even figuring out like non-exempt versus exempt. So it's certainly a large upfront number. Now, when you're doing this research, if it's new to you, you won't need to necessarily do it again for the next employee. So upfront, I mean, I don't know that there's everyone's different, right? So I don't know that there's a set amount of time. Typically if I'm doing a handbook, and I mean, that could be up to, it depends on the company and how many employees they have. So that could be like a handbook alone could be 40 hours, or, you know, it could be pretty substantial. Especially if you have no knowledge of that. I don't always recommend also using what you find on the internet, like an employee handbook template is not always the best route. I would say bringing on an expert to help you with those things. Creating policies, it depends how many stakeholders are involved, right? If you have like multiple business owners and you want to talk through like what your paid time off, sick day policies are, that's going to take some additional time. So if these are not things, if you're just like, I want someone in tomorrow, you could certainly get the I-9 out of the way, the W-4 out of the way. You could set all that up in a day, and you could have the basics, foundational pieces ready in a day, and that would be great. And you can always work on the additional policies in time as your business allows.
I'm sure that's great for some of those folks who experience that crunch time or might have seasonal issues.
Yes, exactly.
We had another question come in here from Bailey, a pretty good one. How do you define or set up a probation period, or do you have any recommendations around probation periods for employees?
I love this question. So everybody's different. So my personal thoughts, and I mean, if you talk to an employment lawyer, they could have a different recommendation. My recommendation is, so for every state except for Montana is an at-will state. That means you can terminate someone. At-will means you can terminate someone without cause, right? So if they're not performing, they're absent many days, you can terminate someone without cause. And so this is where it becomes very important. If you have policies in place around what is tardiness and absenteeism, what does that mean to your business? What does that look like? If you have policies in place, it makes it a whole lot easier to just terminate someone if needed. And where the probationary period comes into place is the standard is probably around 90 days. Now, lots of businesses don't need a probationary period because you can essentially terminate anyone if you're in an at-will state at any time. It's more important that you have policies to base your decisions off of and to bring those to the employee. So essentially, you could have a business with no probationary period because you could terminate that person in 91 days if you had a 90-day probationary period, and it'd still be the same. But a lot of businesses do lean towards a 3-month, 90-day probationary period. And the reason for that is it does play into sometimes when you do have benefits. You could say, there's a 90-day probationary period in which then you could sign up for the 401k, or that's where the probationary periods become more important versus if someone's not performing to your standards within those 90 days, like the probationary period is kind of, you don't necessarily even need it in most cases.
I think that's a really good point. The probationary period, it seems like is probably better aimed at things like benefits than necessarily whether employment is working out.
Yes, exactly. But some employers choose to have it, and that is totally fine too. And especially if you are in a state, Montana, where it is not an at-will state, it's a non-at-will state, then that becomes a little bit different.
We have time probably for 1 or 2 more questions, so please feel free to put those in the Q&A panel. We did have a question here from Jenny. She runs a small residential cleaning business and she really needs to grow, but the margins are really thin. Are there any grants, or are you aware of anything like grants or financial assistance to help with the costs of covering an employee or hiring a contractor?
I'm sure I'm not aware of any specific, employee state grants. I'm sure that there are some grants available, which maybe SCORE can help locate what those grants are for small businesses. For a contractor, the cost is going to be so minimal that the contractor would typically provide their own supplies because they're a contractor. So they would provide their own materials and supplies in that if you're contracting cleaners, I'm just presuming. And so that might be the better route, is hiring on a contractor. But then you would want to be very aware of whether you're dictating their schedule and things like that, what we talked about in the beginning. So, but if it's a short-term assignment in which they can choose the different, customers that they help in their cleaning business, then maybe a contractor is a better route to start with than hiring a full-time or part-time employee.
Yeah, and I think there are sometimes employment grants that can come up, but they're kind of few and far in between. And a lot of times they happen at like a state or a city level. So the state of Maine might have some employment grants, or the city of Portland might have a grant program for hiring an employee. It looks like one of our mentors actually put in chat, the city of Portland has a grant program for hiring right now.
Oh, good.
So those can be available, but it can be very sparse. We had another few questions come in here from Francis. And this kind of touches on some of the things that you were just speaking about in relation to that line between independent contractors and employees. Is it possible to hire an independent contractor and provide them with a company computer to use, or does that potentially mean they're considered an employee?
A lot of companies do this. I would say it's not necessarily the best. You want to make sure that there are clear differentiators between your employees and your contractors. Classification cases are on the rise. They're so prevalent now, especially with remote work. So I would probably lean away from providing a company laptop. That's a very gray area, and I'm sure if there's any employment lawyer on this call, that they would probably agree. You can provide the laptop, but I would say that's a gray area, and I would lean away from it.
Yeah, thank you. It looks like we also had a comment from Tony in the chat. Some state workforce programs have help for hiring new employees. I know that's something that Matt Wagner at the Department of Labor does. So you can always reach out to the Department of Labor and see if they have anything available as well. And but with that, I think that pretty much reaches our time here. So I want to say thank you very much, Brita, for joining us today and educating us on what it's like to hire that employee, or first employee. I didn't realize how much can go into it, but I guess it really kind of comes down to how much you can put into it.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you so much for having me today. This was fun to share my experience, and I hope everyone found this helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Keep an eye out on your email where we'll be sending out the slides. And that email will also have a link if you want to sign up for a SCORE mentor, or if you have further questions for Brita, just feel free to send us a message. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you.